This video will take a quick look at the lexicon, also known as the vocabulary words in the English language. We'll explore why it's important to teach it in an English language classroom and why it has been so often put aside in favor of a focus on grammar. Just to get us started at looking at vocabulary, before we get started looking at vocabulary, let's stop and do a quick exercise I've designed to put you in your students' shoes for a few moments. Sometimes, as English language teachers, we forget how hard it is to learn a second language and some of the challenges our students face. So this one is designed to put you in the shoes of a second language learner, but the language is not English, it's German. So here we go. Please listen to me as I read the text out loud, and try to guess to see if you can understand what's going on. And excuse my German accent, it's been a while since I've taken a class. Here we go. Hans und seine Mutter leben in einem kleinen Hause auf dem Land. Sie sind sehr arm. Hans, ich habe Hunger. Bringe mir Tee und Brot, sagt Hans' Mutter. Entschuldigung, Mutter, aber wir haben keine Tee und auch keine Brote, sagt Hans. Du dummer Junge, ich habe Hunger. Geh zum Markt und verkauf etwas, damit wir Essen kaufen können, sagt sie. Entschuldigung, Mutter, aber wir haben nichts zu verkaufen, sagt Hans. Sei nicht so dumm, sagt Hans' Mutter. Verkaufe den Tisch, dann kaufe die Stühle, dann verkaufe irgendetwas. Ich habe Hunger. Hans denkt einen Moment nach und sagt, wir können dort die Kuchen verkaufen, aber ich glaube nicht, dass es eine gute Idee ist. Sie gibt uns jeden Tag gut Milch. Aber Hans' Mutter hört nicht zu. Ich habe Hunger, sagt sie. Bringe die Kuchen morgen zum Markt und verkaufe sie nicht für unter 10 Euro. Did you guess what this story was about? Any of the words seem slightly familiar? This picture might help. Did you guess that this text was taken from the story of Jack and the Beanstalk? As a second language learner, what helped you to guess? What strategies did you use to help you to try and understand the text? Do you think these are strategies that your students might use? What helped you more? Some of the words that seemed familiar? Perhaps the grammatical structure? Maybe both. Keep that in mind as we move forward. One of the things we're going to talk about is the ways that people learn language. Well, when we first learn language, we don't actually start by learning the grammar rules. We start by learning vocabulary words. In fact, when we first learn language, it takes us a whole year, usually, of input hearing a language spoken before we can start to speak. When we do start to speak, it's in simple sentences moving from 1 or 2 word combinations to longer combinations. So, for example, my son's first word was mum and then ball. My second son's first sentence was, no, that mine, because he needed to defend his toy. So let's be clear. ELL learners are not babies. They have already acquired many language skills and metacognition that they bring to the classroom. However, we sometimes forget that not speaking in a language right away is totally normal. If you had read the story in the previous slide, would you still be able to speak in German? Perhaps not. We need to hear and absorb a lot of language before we can start to speak. Also, speaking in simple words or phrases is normal at the start and really should be encouraged. The most useful words and phrases should be learned and taught first, so that's where we need to put our emphasis. And we must teach vocabulary and useful phrases before we start to look at grammar. Otherwise, it's like teaching in addition and subtraction without even knowing how to count. This week you are asked to read the article by Andrew Sheehan, and I chose this because it's really practical and hands-on and talks about how to teach vocabulary. Sheehan compares vocabulary learning to Cinderella, He says that preference has always been given to the other two sisters, grammar and more grammar. I love that analogy. However, we know that lexical competence is at the heart of communicative competence. That is, we need to know vocabulary and important expressions in order to communicate effectively. So, if that's the case, then why did most teachers feel more comfortable teaching grammar than vocabulary? Why do they start that way round? Well, one of the reasons is it's how they learned themselves. Because if you read if you watched the history slide and read the article for week 1, then you'll know that there's a long history of learning language through grammar. Also, grammar is a finite system. In other words, once you've learned all the rules for past tense verbs, it's done and over with, where vocabulary is constantly evolving, as we'll talk about a little later. So why then is it important to learn vocabulary and lexical units? Well, Sheehan says vocabulary and lexical units are actually at the heart of learning and communication. The vocabulary and lexical expressions can sustain a great deal of rudimentary communication without much support from any other aspect of the language system. If you are traveling to a different country, you can get by knowing a few basic words or phrases. But if you don't know how to conjugate the past tense verbs, it's not as important as being able to say, where is the, can I have? So, how many word families should someone learning English know initially, ideally, and long term? In the article, Sheehan mentions that most English language learners know about 500 words, which is functionally useless. You can't get by on a daily basis in another language knowing only 500 words. So he says we should aim for about 2,000 words, and those 2,000 word families are the most useful ones. Not words like esoteric, but words like drink or difficult. We should end up around 10,000 words. So if it's important to know words, and lots of them, what does it actually mean to know a word? Well, this is not just knowing what the meaning of it is, the semantics. You need to be able to understand it when you hear it spoken or read it written. You need to be able to recall it when needed. You need to use it with the correct meaning and in a grammatically correct way, pronounce it correctly, know which words to use it with, spell it correctly, use it in the right situation, know if it has positive or negative connotations, and know when or when not to use it. So that is an awful lot of information about when you're learning and teaching vocabulary. So here's some of the ways that Sheehan suggests we should teach vocabulary. The first thing is that we should recycle and revise vocabulary a lot. So this should be done in a systematic way. In other words, we should decide which words are really important for learners to know. Which ones do they need most if they're going to communicate with other people? And teach that vocabulary systematically. Show it to them in short texts, read it out loud, practice saying expressions, all around the same vocabulary words. And this can be done in much the same way we do with grammar. We can have a list of, let's say, 7 to 10 vocabulary words a week that we're really functioning and really practicing in functional language. I even did this with my advanced learners. So they had words like esoteric and they had to study because they were enriched. Sorry, they were enriched students. My brain is going crazy today. They are enriched students, so they already spoke English very, very well, but their vocabulary could still be increased. So we used words from the SAT exam and learned those in fun ways. Teachers should know principles and techniques of vocabulary development and also know meta-language of vocabulary development. So let's start off learning a little bit of the meta-language. What do recycling and revising words imply? Well, as I mentioned before, you need to present, revise, and review the words again and again and again in a variety of different contexts. So whether we see that in a book, or in a dialogue, or say it, or put it in crosswords, or word searches, in films, draw your students' attention to that. Did you know that you need to see a word in context 7 to 10 times before the meaning starts to become implicit for you? Sheehan also talks about language having different registers and how they have, each register has different lexicons. I would argue that when you go to different subcultures, there are a lot of different words that are used, and we keep making them up every day. For example, students in the TESOL program or in the MATL program would understand what the PFEQ means, or the POL, or Competency 1, whereas someone in a science program would have no idea what we're talking about. Anyway, so let's move on. How do we teach vocabulary? And this is where the article gets really good. One of the best suggestions that Sheehan makes, in my humble opinion, is to have learners create their own individualized dictionary or vocabulary notebook. For those of you who are keen on differentiation, this technique will really appeal to you because it asks first that the learner themselves select what vocabulary they're interested in learning. And second, it utilizes the learner's own preferred learning styles by encouraging them to either write the word in their first language or draw an image that helps them be reminded of what it means. It also includes really useful information about when to use the word, how to pronounce it, common collocations, and sample sentences. Have a look again at the slide explaining what it means to know a word, and you'll see this technique really helps English language learners know the word in several dimensions. So how does this look practically in a class? Well, if everybody is doing silent reading for 15-20 minutes in class, which I did typically every day, one of the things I would ask my students to do is, while they were reading, to take note of a couple of words that were new to them, or that they hadn't heard before, or that they'd like to use. So their task for the day was to choose 2 or 3 words and write it in their vocabulary notebook. That way and then the challenge next time was to be able to use those words in their own writing and response. For ESL learners, this can be anytime they make a mistake with a vocabulary word or spelling, or anytime you're introducing new words that are key or important to the unit or theme that you're working on. You can have them choose from a list of 20, which 10 they'd really like to focus on. Okay. Sheehan also suggests that when you're teaching vocabulary, you should organize it by topic or themes. Now, a lot of workbooks are organized this way, so we have themes about going camping, or having a party, or going out to a restaurant. And the reason we do this is actually based in psychology and cognitive science for something called a schemata, or a schema. It describes sort of a pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories of information. So the way that cognitive science believes we learn is by taking new pieces of information and putting them into schema that already exists in our brain. So the example that I like to use in class is if we have ideas about what a vampire is, based on popular culture, and then we read a new book that says something different about vampires. For example, they sparkle in the sunlight. We put that information into our schema and question it and organize it. So this is a way to help students learn more effectively. Okay, this is why and it's also why we typically learn vocabulary in categories, as I mentioned. Okay. The other thing he said is to focus on the meaning of the word, and the reason for this is it makes it immediately relevant for the student. They need to know what a word means, but also things like collocations, semantic sets, and register. So when to use a formal word, or when a word might be more informal, when words are found together. My favorite example is I had a really hard time teaching my students why we would use the preposition getting into trouble and then getting out of trouble. Well, because it's not actually a preposition, it's a collocation, which is a group of words that are usually found together, almost like a little idiomatic language. The other thing he suggests is to focus on form. So looking at things like root words, the root word to run, a runner, running, ran, and all the other forms that go around it. Run off. And you'll see in a minute a couple of exercises with things like less or full. All right, so here's some of the activities Sheehan suggests that focus on meaning. As you can see in the first one, he groups words and discusses grouping words together. He's got a whole list of animals there. What you can do with word groups like this is to get students to work with a partner and put them into different categories. Maybe the category is domestic animals, or animals that can be found in North America, or animals that have fur, or animals that have scales. It's up to the students, but the idea is to get them to learn the vocabulary words through discussing with their peers. On the right-hand side, you're going to see an activity that will appeal to intermediate or advanced students. This is a normal and extreme adjective exercises. So the nuances of meaning are implicit for most English language speakers, but they're not always apparent for people who are learning English as a second language. So the idea between dirty and filthy might escape them a little. So, and here's another one that talks about meaning, which I love, because it's not always apparent why we can have a hard exam but not a soft one. What makes the skin rough but not calm? These kind of exercises can really help students dig into the nuances of vocabulary words. Finally, another activity is to group the words in a graphic organizer. I love graphic organizers because I find they really appeal to visual learners, and a lot of our students are visual or logical. So what I used to do is have a word wall in our classroom, and we would do like a word brainstorming this way. The general category is food, and I would challenge the students to come up with as many kinds of food as possible and the categories of food. And you can do this with all different things, classroom objects, things you find. I think there's even games. Name as many things you can find in a backpack in 10 minutes or less. A lot of fun. You can even integrate this into the vocabulary notebook. This is talking about the grammatical function. So this one was talking about the suffixes and prefixes. So useless and useful work, but home and homeless works, but not homeful. So we can talk to our students about that. Finally, there's nothing wrong with flashcards when learning new vocabulary. These can be used in a variety of ways. You can use single words can be written on one side of a flashcard with definitions on another, and you can practice them in pairs with games like mix and match, or just even testing your partner. How many can you get through in 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes? And you can also take those cards and manipulate them semantically by word class, like we were doing with the word grouping. They can actually be moved around on a desk. Or you can do them as a kind of bingo or word matching game. And you can put them together so you can take words that go together. My example was always get into trouble. So if you have the word get and trouble, you can put those together and figure out which words would work together. So get into trouble or get out of trouble, 3 different cards. Of course, technology can play a role here as well if you decide to gamify. So all different ways that flashcards can be used. I like to get the students to create their own flashcards. So when they learn a new word, encourage them not only to put it in their vocabulary notebook, but also you can hand out flashcards and get them to write it down and have more chance to gamify with the class. Gamification is an awesome way of teaching and learning anything, and especially vocabulary. Okay, we're heading into the end stretch of this, but I did want to talk about one more thing, and that is that the lexicon is not static. Language, and the English language is no exception here, is organic. Words are constantly being added to the language officially and unofficially all the time. Our language is approximately 1 million words in its lexicon, but as I say, that's kind of a rotating affair. If you look at English language that's spoken even 50 to 100 years ago, 200 years ago, you'll see it's changed a lot. The estimates are between 1,000 and 5,400 are added, but I would argue that there's a lot more, depending on what subculture you belong to. All right, here's some of the ways of making new words, which I thought were kind of interesting. If you are really into etymology, or if your students are inspired to learn new vocabulary, especially adults, this is a great way of explaining how words happen, how new words come to be. If you teach them how words are formed, it can help them increase their vocabulary and see how grammar and vocabulary intersect. When you move into the grammar modules, looking at negation, preposition, and phrasal verbs, this will really help you as well. You can also, with your ESL students, if they're interested, play games where you can challenge them to create new words in English, or the reverse engineer. Where does the word come from? And here are some of the ways. You can add a prefix, which is derivation. You can remove a prefix, which is back formation. English does this so often, compounding, throwing two words together. English and German do this all the time. Repurposing, so taking a word from one context and applying it to another. Conversion, taking it from one word class and using it in another. I used to have a joke with my enriched students when they used the F word inappropriately. They had to conjugate it in all the different ways that it can be used as a noun, a verb, an adjective, an adverb, and explain when and when it's not appropriate to be used. Eponyms, so words named after people. Did you know that the sandwich was named after the Earl of Sandwich? Abbreviations are also cool. There are ones that come from longer words or expressions, like scuba. Did you know that the English goodbye is actually an abbreviation of the expression God be with you? It's kind of cool, right? Loan words. We do this all the time, especially in Montreal. We borrow words from other languages. It's mainly French and German and Latin and Greek, but anywhere that the English language has gone, we've taken and borrowed and incorporated words from other languages. Automatopoeia is kind of fun if you do anything with poetry, like buzz. Reduplication. Hip-hop, nonce words, quark, bling, error. Sometimes, did you know that scramble comes from Scrabble? And portmanteau, which I love because it itself is a loan word. It's like compounding, but things like sitcom. So that will help students not only make new words, but also understand them if you can pull them apart. If you were in class with me in person, we do a great activity where you could show the students the meaning of a word through scaffolding, but I'll try and find a way to make that possible online. All right, before we go, just a quick word about cognates, and this has come up in some of your assignments already where you discuss your students' misuse of some words in French and in English, a reliance on French and using the word in French and trying to make it pass in English. A really good example of this that happens all the time in Montreal classrooms is when my students say things like, I am sportif, because the word sport exists in French and in English, but it doesn't work as an adjective. So to bring you back again, if you remember the very first exercise we did with Hans und seine Mutter, Hans and his mother. One strategy that a lot of students use is looking at cognates. So those are words. What's a cognate? It's a word that looks and sounds similar in one language to another and has similar meaning. So for here, Hans und seine Mutter, can you see the two words there that might be similar in German and English? And, Mutter, mother, Hans and seine Mother leben in einem kleinen Haus. Believe it or not, German has a lot of words that are very similar to English, and that's because of the history of the language. English and German were the same language about 1,500 years ago, because the original English people, the Saxons, they weren't even original. They followed the Celts. But the Saxon tribes that came over from Germany around the year 300, 400, 500, not even, my history's all gone. But the Saxons that were there were originated from the mainland of Europe. And they were living in England for a very long time until around the year 1000, when Guillaume the Conqueror came over. So what's really interesting historically about English is that a lot of our everyday words, or words that have to do with table and house and dog and cat, our everyday words are actually Germanic in origin, whereas our, what I like to call $20 words, come from the time when the aristocrats who spoke French, essentially. So in English, do we have more core words with Germanic or Romantic origins? Well, actually, core words are Germanic, whereas all our sort of higher level words or more intellectual and abstract words tend to be more Romantic. All right, how does this create confusion for our learners? Well, the thing is that, as I mentioned, our especially Francophones, they tend to overuse our cognates with romantic origins that have particular connotations and are not appropriate to context. So they use the strategy of words like sport, and saying, okay, that works. It works in both languages, so I'm going to be able to use it. Sport works, so sportif will work. Well, no, we don't say I am sportif. In English, we say I am athletic. So explaining to the students why it works in some contexts but not in others is really helpful for them to understand why it's a mistake and to really become aware of it and avoid it. So when are cognate words useful? Words that are sort of similar in French and in English, for example. They're really useful for reception. That is, when students are trying to read or understand things that are being said, just like when we were trying to understand Hans und seine Mutter in Jack and the Beanstalk. When do cognates pose a problem? When they are producing language. So if you see that your students are often using the wrong word, check and see with them, what is their first language? Is this an issue of them using the L1 translation incorrectly? That's a possible issue. So, thanks for listening to this about the vocabulary words. I'm sorry for all the mistakes. Believe it or not, this is my 4th take, so thanks for your patience. Just a final word. Keep in mind as you work with your ELL students that some of the mistakes they're making are not actually grammatical. They aren't following any syntactic, that is structural grammatical rule. They're actually best addressed by thinking about those mistakes as lexical or vocabulary issues. That's it.